Okay, guys, welcome back. This should be Thursday night that you're watching this, and we're moving on to our our third topic within the social movements unit that we're talking about in U.S. history. Now, we've looked at the revolution, in which we talked about how society impacted leading up to the actual war itself. We've looked at women's rights as far as the 19th Amendment goes. We also looked at the 18th Amendment and had our class discussion, and you guys will be receiving grades for that over spring break. And now what we're really coming to is the progressive era, okay? And the reason that it's called the progressive era is because we see a lot of progress made in society. And there's a lot of amendments that are passed during this time period that have had a positive impact on the society that we live in today. You see, especially the ones that we're going to focus on, the amendments, the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments. So you see the women's rights movement intertwined with the progressive era because women are primarily the beginning or the movers of this reform movement, okay? And so we're going to look at the issues that came about during this time period and then relate it back to what we see today, especially in today's world. Okay, so looking at the roots of the progressive era, all right, we're coming to the 1900s. All right, and so we've come through two industrial revolutions. We've come through the first that began in the 1700s over in Great Britain and then made its way over to the United States. And then we go through a second industrial revolution where we end up seeing an influx of immigrants coming from not only Great Britain, France, Ireland, but then we also see a new wave of immigrants coming over from Southern and Eastern Europe. And there's a lot of backlash that comes with these people because they come from those Eastern European countries, Southern European countries, whereas before those old immigrants that had come to the United States had a lot in common culturally. Religion was the same, language was the same, a lot of the same customs because Americans were descendants of those people, the British most namely, but also, like I said, the French and then the Irish as well. But now all of a sudden you see Germans, you see Italians, you see Eastern Europeans coming over that are Catholic, that have different languages, they don't speak English, they have different customs, and you see a lot of backlash coming against those people. And so what we end up seeing is a larger society created of this lower class people, mainly immigrants in the working class, that live beneath the poverty line, and not just in the poverty line that we think of today, but basically work in the most dangerous places, live in the most unsanitary and dangerous places, and don't have direct access to, education and ways to improve their lives because of either discrimination or because of their low income level, and they can't afford to get out of the cycle of poverty that we even talk about in today's society. And so we see the progressive movement during the Industrial Revolution because we see all these inventions lead to the urbanization and industrialization of cities. Well, before that time, most Americans were farmers. They lived in rural areas, but all of a sudden we see the United States begin to change, right? Basically leading up to the Civil War and then right after, we see an influx of new technology like steel, oil, finance, things like that come along, and we begin to see these new inventions that change our lives. And along with these changes, you begin to see progressive reforms put in place as people adjust to a new world that's been created, and then see the safety hazards and things that go along with that, and attempt to correct those wrongs that they believe to be perceived in society. And what these progressives try to do is they try to change the role of government. Before, we had a smaller government that took on very little debt, was not very active in American society and regulating business and the economy, but all of a sudden you have this enormous capitalist corporate economy, this industrialized economy, and it affects millions of people, whereas before farmers were able to grow their own food, they lived on a plot of land that was their own, and you don't see a lot of human interaction. Now you see the majority of the population begin to move from the farming life into city life and work in factories, and along with that comes conditions that are just unacceptable. And that's what these progressives aim to do, and they try to, like it says there in the underlying part, their overarching goal is to use the government as an agency of human welfare, basically meaning that they're going to create a libertarian state, not a welfare state, but a government that helps its people achieve, and basically takes care of its people in a way that they deserve to be protected. And that's what we're going to look at, some of those issues. And if you look at today, that's some of the arguments with the conservative Republican Party. The Tea Party that we see today believes that Barack Obama, President Obama, has turned our government into a welfare state, whereas Democrats tend to be more progressive or liberal, which is where that terminology comes from, in helping people reach a certain level of economic status in society, or help them live a standard of life that has become known as the American dream. And so we can talk about that in modern times as well. But like it says down there at the bottom right here, the roots of progressivism, or the progressive era, begin with the Greenback Party and the Populist Party of the 1890s. And the Populist Party is primarily representative of farmers in America, because you see a lot of farmers begin to have to industrialize. They have to take out loans to buy more farming equipment. They have to take out tractors, plows, things like that, to be able to compete with these larger industrialized farms. The only problem is that you see farmers take on all this debt, and then they're unable to pay that back. And that's really when you begin to see the American people, this grassroots movement, push for the government to become more involved, so that the government can regulate these larger businesses, such as the railroads, such as steel and oil, with John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie running those corporations to make millions and millions of dollars, while the majority of Americans, well, not the majority of Americans, but a large portion of the American population lives below the poverty line, okay? And so we're going to look at some of these progressives, mainly starting with women that began this movement, and then moving on to the men and the writers, things like that, that had a large impact over this, okay? This slide is a good review for you if you don't remember populism. I'm not going to go through and read it, but if you wanted to take time and stop the video right here to be able to review the reasons for the populist movement, the main characters that are involved, obviously right there, William Jennings Bryan, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Morgan, and then in the bottom left corner you see that political cartoon we've looked at with President McKinley looking at a map of the Philippines, and then Lady Liberty standing behind saying how hypocritical it was that we could spread civilization when you see what's going on in the Jim Crow South. So just to give you some contextualization, what's going on in American society as we talk about these different movements and making connections to our previous units, okay? Moving forward, issues of the industrial era. I told you that the progressive movement is a result of industrialization, and the first industrial revolution and the second industrial revolution. And what you see, these issues come about that these progressives try to fix are monopolies and trust, which eliminate competition in the American economy. The reason that is an issue is because then you don't see price competition, and you're stuck paying a flat rate because there's no competition business-wise in the realm that people are selling and buying goods. Workplace conditions. We have looked at this. This is the reason for the formation of unions, labor unions in the United States, like the AFL under Samuel Gompers, became so unsanitary, became so unsafe, especially in steel mills, on railroads, factories in general. We'll look at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Those workplace conditions not only led to disease, but also to multiple deaths over a long period of time. We look at child labor as an issue of the industrial era, because a lot of children went to work to help support their families. But if you're at work, you're not at school getting an education. And so again, we talk about the cycle of poverty continuing, and never able to get an education, you're never able to improve yourself. And so you're stuck in that same cycle. You worked as a child, and then you're going to work as an adult. As a result of not being able to get a good enough job as an adult because you don't have the education, your children they're going to have to work all day, and they're not going to be able to go to school. And that really is where you see the education reform movement passing child labor laws, so that we can have children in school learning so that they can improve their lives. And if they improve their lives, then the American economy is going to do better, because you're not only going to have more businesses, but you're going to have more consumers. And then finally, looking at the living conditions of the poor, this is where you get to talk about tenements, okay? And really slums. This is where that term comes from, is because you see up to 10 people sharing a one-room apartment. You have your bedroom, your kitchen, your bathroom, anything and everything that you could think of in one room with 10 people. And not necessarily having a shower that is available because you don't have central plumbing. And so these are some of the issues that the progressives tried to change. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these people. I'm not going to read through each and every one of these. Most notably, the progressive that we need to take account of is Jacob Riis, which happens to be this gentleman right here. And his famous expose, a piece of literature that he wrote, was known as How the Other Half Lives in 1890. And basically what it was a picture book along with commentary that showed the life of, like it says right here, show the life of squalor in the New York slums, okay? And this book heavily influences our first progressive president, Theodore Roosevelt, who eventually becomes the police commissioner of New York, eventually is the governor of New York. We talked about the robber barons trying to get rid of Teddy Roosevelt and bury him in the vice presidency. That backfires when William McKinley is assassinated, and then Theodore Roosevelt is put into the presidency, and like I said, becomes our first progressive president, okay? We're just going to look through a couple of these guys and what their influence, but the main purpose of these progressive era writers is that they expose the living conditions, the working conditions, the way that these working class people are abused by the management and owners of factories, and try to get the middle class to spurn them to change and petition the government and to move American society where we don't have this huge gap between the rich and the poor. And that is a current issue that we talk about today, is income inequality throughout the United States. There is a large gap between the very rich and the very poor. And that's something that we'll talk about under the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush when we talk about tax reform of the upper 1% and things like that. We'll get into those things. Causes that gain steam during the progressive era. When things are not going well for the majority of the American population, you begin to see radical issues spring up. So when we look at the progressive era and we look at the majority of Americans, or a large portion of Americans living in poverty, that's when you start to turn to radical movements such as socialism, like it says right there, influenced by strong European governments, most notably in the Soviet Union and Europe, called for more government action in the United States and started gaining votes at the ballots box. You see candidates like Eugene V. Debs start to really grab the ear of the American public during this time period, because they want change and they feel like in a capitalist society they're never going to be able to move up the economic ladder, and so they need to look outside of that to understand what they can do to improve their conditions. And when you're trying to put food on the table for your family, you're going to turn to extreme measures, okay? And that's where you see socialism, that's where you see communism. In Europe after the Great Depression, that's where you see fascism come into play, because people are so desperate to be able to feed their families and to be able to go to work, they turn to people like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler that come to power during the 1930s and eventually lead to World War II. But we'll get to that in a later unit when we talk about our presidents. Obviously, we've talked about wars. But we have talked about the robber barons at length in our economic unit. They championed an idea known as social Darwinism, meaning that the strong will survive, or the strong should survive. And these guys became basically with the understanding that a business or a person that has the talent, the drive, the will, the ability to move themselves up in not only their economic class, but their social class, should be allowed to thrive. I should be able to make as much money as I want to, and nobody should get in my way. Well, the flip side of that coin, you see the progressives take on a theory known as the social gospel, and that is based on Christian charity, meaning that we have to take care of our brothers and sisters who may not be doing as well as we are. And so it is our social duty to take care of those people that live beneath their means, or beneath the poverty level. And later on in his life, Andrew Carnegie actually writes The Gospel of Wealth, in which he talks about it is not the job of the government, but it is the job of the rich to provide that charity and become trustees of America's wealth, because those lower level people don't understand how to utilize that money to the best benefit of the American public. And that's when we got into the argument of, are these guys robber barons or are they captains of industry? Okay. You also see female suffragists. Again, there's the female movement pushing change in American society, not just with their own cause, with women's right to vote, equal opportunity in the workplace, but also with abolition, and then again with reforms in education, the workplace, living conditions. Most notably, Jane Addams, who was the founder of Hull House, which is basically a reform movement that allows immigrants and the poor working class to get an education, to learn how to become Americans so that they're able to assimilate into our society. Looking at Theodore Roosevelt, like I had previously said, he is our first progressive president, and I apologize, and becomes known as the Trust Buster. Okay, and so what you end up seeing here is Theodore Roosevelt is highly disturbed by the people that live in these working conditions. And he comes up with the term of muckrakers. And it's not meant as a positive thing, but as a negative comment, because he believes that these writers stir up muck, but then they don't come to any solution to those problems. And like it says right here in this meme that I found, complaining about a problem without proposing a solution is called whining. And so that term sticks, muckrakers, with these journalists and these people that are exposing how the other half lives to steal Jacob Riis's title. but not offering a solution. And what they saw as a solution is to make the American public aware of the injustices that was occurring as a result of our new society that had been created by the Industrial Revolution. Again, some more examples of muckrakers, like it says up there, that are active and prolific. Lincoln Steffens is one of the largest, most outspoken critics of political bosses, which is corruption. Political bosses are mayors of large cities. William Boss Tweed was a huge political boss in New York City that took money from the city itself, was offered bribes, did favors for immigrants, appointed his friends into important positions, the police chief, the fire commissioner, things like that, that eventually lead to reform. And these guys are able to stay in power. Political bosses are able to stay in power because they keep the right people happy. Now, that is not a true form of democracy, but it's basically social Darwinism. I'm strong enough to keep my position, my power, then I should be allowed to. And that goes against the social gospel that was championed by these progressive movers. Again, I'm not going to go through each of these, but just have an understanding of what their goals were, what their objectives were in trying to publicize things like this, okay? Again, just some more examples: John Spargo, Ray Stannard Baker, Dr. Harvey Wiley, and like it says down here, muckrakers were loud about the ills but didn't offer cures. To the muckrakers, the cure for societal ills was democracy, not meaning politicians, but that the American public would remedy the problems. And a lot of that came from the American public once they saw how these people were living, what it was really like. And that's why it's so important today we talk about how superficial the news is. A lot of the American public are uninformed because the news focuses on things like TMZ. What are celebrities doing? What's going on? What's the latest scandal in the White House? Looking at things that don't matter, as opposed to looking at real social issues that could change the way that America operates, and keeping the American public uninformed because they're worried about TV ratings and not actually reporting the real news. Okay, but again, that's another connection to modern day and something that we could discuss more in depth later on. Okay, looking at political progress, things that have occurred as a result of people pushing for political change. For example, trying to get rid of people like Boss Tweed in New York and reform the political system, especially at the local level. You see the initiative, referendums, recalls, secret ballots, like it says down there. The 17th Amendment calls for the direct election of senators by the people and not state legislatures. Okay, obviously female suffrage, like it says at the bottom, doesn't come along until the 1920s. Think about that. So if you go through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the 2000s, I mean, women have only been able to vote for 100 years. That's not that large. If you think in the course of history, that's not that long of a time. Think about the United States and its vast history. Women have only had a say in a couple or a handful of presidents in our political formatting. And that's some of the things that we looked at the other day during our discussion, is the lack of participation politically of women, not just voting wise, but also holding higher offices and things that go with that. Okay. Looking at progressivism in the cities and the states, a large progressive leader was Wisconsin Governor Robert Fighting Bob La Follette, who pushed for a lot of things like initiatives and reforms, being able to pull power back from big businesses and being able to abuse not only their workers, but also their families, because their families feel the effects of living in poverty. Okay, like I said, I'm not going to run through each and everything here. This is you can read through this for your information. But again, it talks about corrupt mayors, city bosses, political bosses, and basically Robert La Follette was able to propose a lot of reforms that help fix those issues on the political level. Okay, progressive women, like it says up there, they're an indispensable catalyst. A catalyst is something that changes or sparks change for an issue. And we talked about why women got involved in reform movements. Well, if you're not allowed to work, you're going to have something to do with your time. And so women decided to positively impact society as a result. And so you see them push for not only their right to vote, prohibition, because they blamed alcohol for the reason that their husbands were abusive, were negligent, weren't around to help raise their children. Because remember, people back in the 1800s drank a whole lot more than we do now. And so you begin to see this push for the 18th Amendment to end abuse, to end basically absentee fathers. But you also see large Supreme Court cases that are passed that help female workers. Mueller versus Oregon. Right here, Lochner versus New York is actually a Supreme Court case that strikes down the effort for a 10-hour workday for bakers, things like that. But the idea is put into the minds of the American public that we need to push for these reforms, okay? probably the largest moment that comes in American history for workplace change is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Okay, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory is basically what it said. They produced shirts. And what they would do is they would keep these women operating these sewing machines for hours at a time. And to make sure that they didn't take breaks, they would lock them in their rooms and they would block off exits so that they couldn't get out. The only problem with that is one, the building inspectors didn't do their job because really there was no definition of what their job was. But two, when a fire breaks out in that company, not only do you see damage done to the business as a whole, but you see hundreds of women, like it says up there, killing 146 mostly young women workers in one afternoon. And all of a sudden you see these protests, these progressives that have been pushing for workplace rights, all of a sudden gain some momentum because you see almost 200 people killed in a workplace accident because fire exits were locked, buildings were locked to make sure that these workers continued to work and produce so that that company could be successful. And that's really when you start to see a push for the 8-hour workday, minimum wages, workplace conditions such as having proper fire escapes. Obviously today you see sprinkler systems, fire alarms, things like that are put in place to make sure that people don't die. When you think about, this is only 150 years ago, think about how barbaric a place that the United States truly was and how hard it was to live in a society like this. So when we think back in history, you got to really think about the decisions that people make are easy to judge when we sit 100 years away from it and say, oh, that's wrong, this is right. But you got to think about what it was like to live in this society. You see a lot of racism still as a result of the ending of the Civil War. You see the Jim Crow South, but not just racism towards African Americans. You see a lot of nativism, and nativism is against these new immigrants that had come over, and white Americans believe that they're stealing their jobs, and not just from these Eastern and Southern Europeans on the East Coast, but you also see that same thing put through on the West Coast with Chinese and Japanese immigrants. You see things like the Chinese Exclusion Act that are pushed through. And as a result, living in this time period makes it hard to be a progressive thinker. So when you think about how wrong Jim Crow laws were, when you think about how wrong the Ku Klux Klan was, and how unrealistic you feel like that may be today, think about that in the context of history where those things are really actual threats. And you see people openly practice discrimination and racism and nativism and all of those things, okay? And think about the way that women were treated. Again, the abolition movement and the women's movement come out as a result of the similarities that women see between themselves and African Americans. Okay, like I talked about, prohibition with the women's movement. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded. Eventually, the 18th Amendment is passed in 1919. However, it is eventually repealed in the 1920s and 1930s with the 21st Amendment because we see an uptake not only in illegal crime spree, but people are drinking anyways. In speakeasies, you see bootleggers that lead to the invention of NASCAR races and things like that. Okay, but that's something that we've gone through and talked about. Notable achievements of the progressives include the 16th Amendment, which calls for the direct income tax. Before, everybody had not necessarily had to pay income taxes, and so you see the government able to raise revenue as a result of that. The 17th Amendment calls for the direct election of senators by the people instead of being chosen by state legislatures. The 18th Amendment, prohibition, even though it's repealed by the 21st, is viewed as obviously a huge victory for the women's movement because they believed it was the cause of a lot of domestic abuse. However, it ended up increasing the crime in the United States because people still wanted to drink. And then finally, the 19th Amendment with women's suffrage in the 1920s, you really see women begin to take off and eventually gain equal footing, or at least on their way to equal footing, with the ability to have a voice in politics. Okay, and again, that's something we talked about in our class conversation on Thursday. All right, so your assignment, I know that I've been a little bit long-winded, but what you're going to do in the computer labs, and I'll have where you're supposed to be on Thursday, you're to create an exhibit that you would see in a museum on the progressive era. Okay, so things like workplace conditions, living conditions, the initiatives and the reforms that are brought along as a result of that. You can create a PowerPoint presentation, or if you have another form of media that you want to use, you can do that as well. Just make sure that I approve that and that you're able to do that. It has to include all aspects discussed in this lecture and be described in detail. Okay, so you don't have to put in word for word what I did, but I want to see you put in effort. Like it says there at the bottom, this needs to be well thought out and carefully crafted. I expect your best effort. Obviously, we're going to do this on a Friday in the computer lab in a day, so you're not going to have time to do it extensively, but I want to see you come up with something that you believe is your best work, is your best effort, and expresses to me what you have learned as a result. I'm not going to put a lot of restrictions and guidelines because I want you to be able to be creative, but at the same time, I don't want you to turn something into me that took you 5 minutes and then think you're going to sit there on the computer for 10, okay? So best efforts forward, and then I will see you in class on Friday. Have a good night.